Today we're doing an introduction to Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. You guys are going to be reading this book, so this is going to give you some of the information that you're going to need, background information that makes it a little bit easier to understand the novel. The first thing to know is that this was both written and set during the Regency Period, which is usually about 1811, 1820. It's the very beginning of the 1800s, very end of the 1700s. The different periods were named after the monarchs, the kings or queens who were in power. So that's why, like in Shakespeare, you have the Elizabethan period because of Queen Elizabeth. You have the Victorian period, which came after the Regency period. That was because of Queen Victoria. The Georgian period for King George, and the Regency period. This was named that way because technically there wasn't a king at that time. King George III, he was basically not sane. He was kind of going crazy, and they decided that he shouldn't be the king. So instead they put his son in charge, who became eventually King George IV. He was known as the Prince Regent. He was running the country, but he wasn't the king because the king was still alive. During that time, there was a lot of support for the arts and architecture, fashions, literature. These kinds of things were very supported. But on the other hand, a lot of the people didn't really like King George IV. They thought that he didn't spend money well. This was also an interesting time period because of the middle class. They became known as the landed gentry. Prior to this, basically the only people that owned land were the aristocrats, the royalty. And what ended up happening was regular people started making more money and they were able to buy land. So usually if you own land, you were either kind of like upper middle class, where you ran your own farm, you ran the land yourself, you worked, or you were upper class and basically became part of the aristocracy, and so you had people who worked the land for you. These are the people that are in this novel. Austen's novels in general, and this one in particular, they take place with the upper class. These were the people that ran England as aristocrats, and the people that lived there and lived with them on their land, they depended on these people for their livelihood. This is a picture of Jane Austen's house. She lived here and wrote most of her novels here, and it's a big house, and her family were probably the landed gentry also. One of the characters, one of the main characters in this novel, probably the second most important, is Mr. Darcy. He is what would be known as the hereditary aristocracy. In other words, these are the people that they became rich because their parents were rich and they inherited their money, they inherited their land. He doesn't have to work. The people that live on his farm and so forth, they run the farm for him, and he just makes money. So he's real wealthy. You also have the Bingleys. So these would be like slightly different because their father got the money and then bought land and was able to move up into the upper class. So he was the newly landed gentry as opposed to hereditary. Then we have the Bennets. These are our family that we follow the most in this novel. They own land, but they're middle class. They work the land themselves. They don't really have a lot of servants. Mr. Darcy probably has people who take care of his house, as opposed to like the Bennets, where they don't have most of this stuff. And they don't have a whole lot of money either, which is part of the problem in the novel. The social life was really different and really important for the characters in the novel. So one of the biggest things that goes on are the dances. These are times when the young people would be able to get together and talk, hang out, and it was acceptable. Now, see, there were really strict rules about what a woman was allowed to do and not to do. And if you wanted people to think of you as a proper lady, you had to be escorted and chaperoned everywhere. You couldn't be alone, basically, with a man. This was important because if people saw you as maybe not being a proper lady, you might find that you'd have people judge you. Maybe you were, kept out of society. And maybe even the worst thing possible is for you not to be able to get a husband. Young ladies really needed to get a husband because women were not allowed to own any property. Your ability to talk, converse with people, your ability to dance, all of these things were judged at these balls. And so it was really important that you had these skills. Speaking of the patriarchy, women didn't really have rights. They didn't have the ability to own land. In fact, they were considered property. It's why a woman had to change her last name, because now she belonged to her husband when she got married. So they needed to get a good marriage so that they could be taken care of. One of the things that would happen is, like, for example, in this novel, Mr. Bennet has 5 daughters. If he dies, the money won't go to his wife or his daughters. The money would actually go to the next oldest male in his family. So this would be a problem, because then the wife and the daughters wouldn't be able to wouldn't have anybody to take care of them, no place to live. So this is like a big deal. You have to get a husband. Entailment is the way that they decide, like, who gets the property, when somebody passes away. So usually it went to the closest relative. In this novel, we also have the theme of social class. Jane Austen was really looking at the ideas that surround social class. You have the problem when the Bennets, who are basically middle class, are mixing with the upper classes, Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley. Austen was looking to find ways to critique this, and that's why our main character, who is Elizabeth Bennet, she breaks the class barrier by having a relationship with Mr. Darcy. Sorry, spoiler alert. Marriage and family is another one of the themes in the novel, that basically, because Mr. Bennet doesn't really have the money to support all of his children, and because he doesn't have any male heirs, it's really super important, and it's the main focus of the novel and the family, to get a good marriage for the daughters. Because otherwise, if you don't get married, you got to stay with your parents, stay with your father, maybe a brother. You were at the mercy of the males in society to take care of you. Also, the ideas of propriety, social decorum, and reputation. If you didn't really follow the social rules, people might see you as damaged goods. They might see you as not somebody who was appropriate to be married. Elizabeth herself is more independently minded, and she values her own personal worth and what she believes in over her reputation and status. This novel was called First Impressions when it was originally written. It took Austen 16 years to have it rewritten and then finally published. Part of the reason for the title would be that people get an idea about somebody when they first meet them, and then they don't really change it, and that complicates things. And people don't see the others as they are. Darcy, he says something in the novel about Elizabeth being tolerable, but not marriage material for him. And so, that's part of what this novel is saying, is that you should look beneath the surface. Satire, this is a form of humor. It's making fun of something. It's really mocking some idea or a person, a group of people, those kinds of things. Instead of coming out and criticizing the people, for example, or the ideas, it shows them to be ridiculous by maybe exaggerating who they are, the way that they act, so that it seems silly. Also, there's sarcasm is an element of satire. So Austen is satirizing Mrs. Bennet and her need to marry her daughters off. In the very first chapter, when Mr. and Mrs. Bennet are talking, pay attention to see that if it seems a little bit silly and crazy, it's because Austen thought so. That's what she was trying to say. This is a narrative style known as free indirect discourse, which is when you have a third-person narrator whose narration will slip in and out of the character's consciousness. So in other words, you will get the character's thoughts and feelings, but they'll be filtered through the third-person narrator, such as in this novel, Elizabeth Bennet's thoughts and feelings will sometimes get filtered through the third-person narrator. It's hard to determine just how much we can trust exactly what the narrator's telling us because of the limited narration. Another thing that this is using is what they call sometimes a comedy of manners, where the comedy a lot of times comes from the way that the people behave toward each other. You get the witty dialogue or banter between the characters, and they incorporate the love affairs. So this is good for your major works data sheet, by the way. And then, you know, the difference between the way the different classes act. Some of the jokes come from, or the humorous situations or the conflict will come from the way that the middle class interacts with the upper class, for example, or maybe isn't supposed to. All right, so that concludes our overview. There'll be another video also talking more specifically about etiquette in this time period that you also need to look at. But hopefully this gave you enough information to get started.